How the Jews Betrayed Mankind, Volume 1, The Sumerian Swindle, 2nd edition, by G_D. Chapter 2, The Land of Mesopotamia, Cradle of Civilization. Today, you might think that there is something new under the scorching desert sun of Iraq. The dry soil is being blown into dust by the bombs of F-16 fighter jets. Huge tracts of the dry and fertile soil, groves of date palms, and the flowing water of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and the towns and villages are being poisoned with depleted uranium ordnance, while pilotless robot killer drones fly high overhead, being piloted via satellite from half a world away. So, you might think that there is something new in the 14,000-year history of Mesopotamia, but you would be wrong. Of course, the tools for killing and the methods of destruction and genocide are more advanced today, but the land is just the same, and the people are just the same as they were in 12,000 BC. Ancient Mesopotamia was located in what is today the modern country of Iraq. The wars that are tearing that land apart today are really being fought over the same reasons that wars were fought in Mesopotamia at the dawn of civilization. The actors and the tools and the war machines are different, but the reasons for bloodshed are the same. The sun, the wind, the water, the mud, and the stars are all the same. The greed and the evil in the hearts of ruthless men are just the same. The corruption of the political leaders and the avarice of the moneylenders is just the same as it has always been. The only difference is found in this book that you are reading. Although over 5,000 years have passed since the Sumerians first began what has become our modern civilization, the geography and weather of modern Iraq is nearly identical to what it was during those earlier times. The climate is extremely hot and dry. Temperatures in central and southern Iraq can reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius. The soil is arid and windswept. Mostly the land is rather flat, with low, undulating mounds and hillocks. In the course of millions of years, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers have meandered throughout the Mesopotamian basin. Picture here, the rain from the mountains in Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains then creates rivers that watered these desert plains, it says. The Euphrates River, the Tigris River, and the Mesopotamian River. Continuing. In the course of millions of years, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers have meandered throughout the Mesopotamian basin, uncovering and redepositing the clay and slit soils of the region and producing a river-made land of mud, clay, and silt, with almost no stone and no minerals. It is a land of dust and dirt and mud and hot sun. There were no trees in ancient Mesopotamia, but there were giant reeds around the rivers and in the southern marshes. What geological variety there was in the somewhat flat landscape consisted of desert, foothills, steppes, and marshes with no rainfall in the summer months. The higher elevation steppe lands in those ancient times were grasslands, almost treeless with an average rainfall of 10 inches. In the foothills, oak, pine, terebinth trees, grasses, wild barley, and wild wheat could grow. The flood season of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers is between April and June, which is too early for winter crops and not long enough for summer crops. So, by appearances, you would at first think that such a desolate place could not possibly produce the world's first civilization. But Mesopotamia is where civilization began, and it was a civilization that grew up out of the water, the mud, and the hot, scorching sun. As the Ice Age was ending, the hunter-gatherer people of 12,000 BC learned that they could make a living by gathering the seeds of the wild grasses that grew throughout the region. What few people there were in the world at that time lived in open-air camps or in caves or in huts built of reeds. As hunters, they had found a good companion with another hunter, the wolves. These became the first domesticated animal by 11,000 BC, and the dog has been man's best friend ever since those Stone Age times. By about 9,000 BC, the people had learned how to make mud bricks. They developed weaving and craft specializations. They carried on long-distance trade in obsidian and copper. As hunters who had killed the adult nannies and who had raised and tamed the kids, they were able to domesticate the goat by 8500 BC. With milk goats, these Stone Age people didn't have to go hungry from scarce game because, by that time, they could use their hunting skills in protecting their herds from predators. By 8000 BC, they had also domesticated the sheep, which provided them with woolen clothes as well as meat. As the Ice Age retreated and the weather warmed, all across the grassy hills of the ancient Near East, the people discovered that if they could gather and store enough grass seeds, that they didn't have to wander about with their goats and sheep, but could stay in one location where the wild grasses provided food both for them as well as their flocks. These grasses grew in such abundance that even a single person working for 2 weeks with an obsidian blade could harvest enough to feed a family of 4 for a year. When an entire family or a village cooperated with such a harvest, there was plenty of food for everybody. Because grain does not decay if it is kept dry, it can last for decades. A reliable food supply allowed for the establishment of permanent camps, allowing wandering hunter-gatherers to settle down into villages where, by 7500 BC, they domesticated the wild pig. By 7000 BC, cattle and the always useful rodent-catching cat were domesticated, and they discovered how to make pottery for cooking and for storing grain away from insects and rodents. All of the peoples living throughout this entire fertile crescent region, stretching in an arc from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, gathered these wild grasses. These grasses sustained a scattering of small, permanent villages for 3,000 years of small farming. But it was in the land between the two rivers of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, with their copious and reliable water supplies, that farming was able to blossom into the foundation for civilized life. The long mountain chain that divides Mesopotamia from Persia, the rich valley of the two rivers from the sand desert, is broken down at its southern end by the watershed of the Karun River. Here is Elam, the east, an alluvian plain closed in on all sides except the western, where it is open to Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. It is geographically a part of Mesopotamia rather than of Persia. The vast deposits of silt carried down by the Karun River from Elam formed a bar across the upper end of the Persian Gulf, which held up the floodwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates so that their silt was deposited against the bar instead of being swept out to sea. With the slackened current, much silt was dropped higher up and gradually filled in the marshes, forming dry land through which the Euphrates cut its bed. Also flowing into this delta region in ancient times, but now dried up, was a fourth river out of Arabia which created the area known to us as Eden, the land of the 4 rivers. The sedimentary soil from these rivers was immensely fertile, and invited settlement, but rich as the soil was and easy as was the tillage, yet to profit by its richness required much labor on a large scale. It was not a land in which the isolated farmer could prosper. The seed had, of course, to be sown in winter, and in spring, just as the young grain sprouted. The river came down in flood, overran and scoured out the fields, and destroyed all hopes of harvest. The river had to be kept in check by artificial banks. The land, if it was to yield a second crop, had to be irrigated by canals. The need was obvious, but the task was beyond the powers of any one landowner. To grow grain in the dry soils of southern Mesopotamia, the farmers dug ditches to carry water from the rivers to the dry fields. This soil, this river-made soil, once it was irrigated, proved to be very fertile, and it produced tremendous crops beneath the bright sun. With plenty of food, with mud bricks for building their homes and clay pottery for cooking and storing their foods, civilization began in southern Iraq, all based upon water, dirt, sun, grain, and intense physical labor. We call these earliest people in Mesopotamia Ubaidians, Ubaidians, after Tel al-Ubaid, where their pottery was first discovered by modern archaeologists. Although they were Stone Age people, using flint and obsidian and bone and wood for their tools, the modern reader should not look down upon these ancient people with disdain. All of these ancient people were of the same species of Homo sapiens as we are, ourselves. So it is important to remember that they had the same feelings, the same love for their children, the same social ambitions, and the same intelligence that we have in our own modern lives. Of course, they did not have the same knowledge and understanding about the world around them or the same educational level as we do. They were less knowledgeable than we are, but they were just as intelligent. Indeed, the knowledge that we ourselves have today is built upon the very knowledge that those early people developed. So, we should look upon those ancient people more as our very own great-great-great-grandparents rather than as some distant and dusty barbarians to whom we owe nothing. That being said, you will find it profitable to keep the humanity of these people in mind during this study so that you can better understand the theme of this book. What we call modern civilization is a direct result of what those early people invented. Even the foundation for the very words that you are now reading were developed by the inhabitants of Mesopotamia when they invented writing over 5,000 years ago. At 9000 BC, as the last of the Ice Age was disappearing, the Udadians... Well, he just switched it up on me. Thought it was Ubadians. So first it was Ubadians, now they're being referred to as Udadians. Or maybe they're two completely different peoples, but... Continuing. At 9000 BC, as the last of the Ice Age was disappearing, the Udadians went about their lives of sowing and reaping grains and domesticating animals. They left behind for us to dig up and to wonder about tools such as hoes, obsidian adzes, ADZES, and knives, sickles, mud bricks and baked bricks, spindle whorls, loom weights, sculpture, painted pottery, and the plow. They marked their possessions with clay stamps and cylinder seals, but they also built canals and irrigation ditches and dedicated large mud brick temples to their gods. And for such architecture, calculation skills, and arithmetic were required, as well as a basic knowledge of geometry. They used water clocks, clay bowls with a small hole in the bottom, which were floated in a basin of water so that they could mark time by how long it took for the bowl to sink. With these clocks, their village chiefs and town governors were able to regulate the amount of irrigation water each field was allowed. Although they had no written records, they relied upon what all of the ancient peoples relied upon, and of which we modern people have limited abilities: their memories. With no written records with which to store information about their past, they used the well-developed faculties of their human brains to memorize the events of their times and to pass along to their children the stories of their past. They began their stories by claiming that all of their civilization got its start at the town of Eridu, E-R-I-D-U, in the southern part of the country. And these stories were passed along to the people who came after the Ubadians. It is important for you to identify with those ancient people as fellow humans so that you can fully understand the theme of this present history. They were just as human in every way as you are. In their clay sculptures we can see how the Ubadians saw themselves, and it is here that I want you to understand some secrets that the archaeologists and scientists have overlooked. The real humanity of those ancient people. You must not look at their sculptures in the same way as do the archaeologists who egotistically consider themselves more modern and therefore more advanced in their own humanity. By doing so, the scientists blind themselves to the advanced knowledge of those ancient people. It is often remarked how reptilian and alien the Ubadian sculptures are. See Figure 1. No, pretty freaky looking. I mean, human body, very broad shoulders, extremely thin, and then like a lizard head. It is often remarked how reptilian and alien the Ubadian sculptures are, and it is difficult for the archaeologists, or almost anybody else, to imagine how a people could look so extraterrestrial and odd. But this is because the modern scientists do not perceive those ancient people through human eyes, but only through cold scientific lenses. They look only at the hard data and forget that the cold pottery and clay sculptures reflect the workmanship of living people who, although they could not read or write their ideas, could sculpt them. To understand the secret knowledge that the Ubadian sculptors were expressing, you need only to ask yourself the question, "Who am I?" or the question, "What am I?" and then try to make a sculpture of yourself or of your friends or family in answer to that question. This is what the Ubadian sculptures did, and this is why their features look so odd, because what they were showing was not just their outer appearance, but their inner being. In this respect, they were expressing something far in advance of what most modern people understand about themselves. In those sculptures, they were expressing their true selves. Certainly, the Ubadians did not look into mirrors because there were no mirrors other than pools of standing water. They knew what they looked like and reflected in water, so their sculptures of themselves were expressing something other than that. They were not fooled in the same way that modern people are fooled by the sharp and reverse image of themselves looking back from a mirrored glass. Most modern people think that what they see in a mirror is a reflection of their true selves. But they are wrong. In a mirror, you are only looking at the reverse reflection of your outside appearance and not your inner being. Can you deny that you exist inside of yourself as well as outside of yourself? Isn't there something inside of you that makes you a human being? You cannot see your inner self in a mirror. For that, you must close and squint your eyes in order to perceive yourself on the inside. To see your false self in a mirror, you must open your eyes. To see your true self within, you must close your eyes. To understand these Ubadian sculptures and to actually see one of these people with your very own eyes, you must see what they saw. Ask yourself the question, "Who am I?" and then breathe gently and look out from your eyes. But do not look out too far. Rather, look through just the slits of your eyes, so as to view yourself in the living act of looking outward. Breathe gently and lower your eyelids. Ask yourself, "Who am I?" and close your eyes slightly into slits and breathe gently and look within yourself at how your face is shaped on the inside, at how your nose breathes life from the inside, at how you can see and feel what you are like on the inside. And why? Because this is the living spirit of you looking out from the inside. This is not the same as looking at a cold and distant reflected image of yourself in a mirror. And so, the view that the ancient Ubadians had of themselves is true, while the view that modern people have of themselves is false. How can you say that you are superior to the ancient people if your views are false? And now you know what they looked like reflected in yourself. This is the meaning of the clay models that the Ubadians made of themselves. They were then, as you are now, a living being looking out through half-closed eyes. This view of themselves as self-contained spirits within a mortal shell may have affected their selfishness. People who think in terms of only themselves are not very empathetic to the lives of their fellows. The slit-eyed reptilian statues that the Ubadians left of themselves not only reflected their inner awareness of self, but also an unconcern for how they were perceived by others. And this selfishness was passed along to the Sumerians, who inherited the Ubadian culture. As the Ubadians grew in numbers, through the success of their agricultural efforts, they began to organize themselves around their priests and temples. The ancient peoples looked to their priests for guidance, and all of the ancient peoples believed in many gods. This is important to remember. All of the ancient peoples believed in the gods. There were no atheists in ancient times. There were no communists, Jews, humanists, or feminists telling them that they were nothing but animals. There were no scientists telling them that they were nothing but monkeys, descended from more primitive monkeys. They wouldn't have believed such fables because they were smarter than that. You can understand these ancient people if you think like a child in awe of creation. For example, that hot, yellow, blinding disk that rises and sets every day and lights up and heats the entire world. How fantastic! But what is it? What could it be? When the clouds partly cover it, it looks like a great bright wheel that rolls across the sky. Or maybe it is a great eye in the sky looking down upon mankind. And of course, the world was flat because you could see that it was laid out as a vast plain with mountains and rivers and a great starry sky full of twinkling, shining gods that circled about overhead. Of course, the stars circled the earth because you could see them move yourself. And the earth was solid and immovable because you could feel it under your feet, as such. And that cool white moon that rises and sets in the night sky, what is it? A goddess? Of course, the ancient ones had no telescopes to tell them that the moon is a rocky sphere orbiting in space, or that the sun is a ball of nuclear gases. But if you look at the world as they saw it, you will see that the bright thing that waxes and wanes in the night sky resembles a disk. The disk changes into horns like on a cow, or perhaps it looks more like a reed boat in the sky. And of course, that great sea of stars is a Milky Way highway, a path through the sky that leads off into distant lands where the gods live and where mankind will someday journey. or clouds and rainbows, birds and beasts, rivers and oceans, rain and wind and lightning and thunder. Look again, O modern man. Look at all of the natural phenomenon that we modern people take for granted. Look at nature again with innocent eyes. All of these things are still just as fresh and full of wonder as they were 12,000 years ago. The only thing that has changed is the dulling of perceptive astuteness of the people today who consider themselves superior to the ancient ones who built the very foundations of our own world culture. To understand those ancient people, you must empty your mind of modern theories and look at the world around you with the mind of child. With the mind of child, it says. A child knows nothing, but is willing to see and hear and learn everything. Only then can you understand what the ancient people knew and what the ancient people are still trying to tell us if we will only listen. The ancient ones have secrets to tell us, but most of us are too arrogant in our knowledge and conceited in our wealth to listen to the dusty past. In this book I will tell you some of those long-lost secrets that have not been told since the world was young. The Ubaidians lived in Iraq for nearly 5,000 years before they learned how to read and write. Can you imagine 5,000 years of a functioning culture but not one person knowing how to read and write? And yet they build cities, monumental architecture, city walls, invented the wheel and agriculture, invented cylinder seals, and by 4000 BC they were experimenting with the very beginnings of writing. Also, they invented something else that would be passed along to the next wave of people entering Mesopotamia. They invented the basics of the Sumerian Swindle, which came into full flower upon the arrival of the Sumerians around 3200 BC. The Sumerian Swindle was no secret that not even today's scientists and modern scholars have been able to understand its workings. Throughout history, this ancient weapon has destroyed entire countries, snuffed out the lives of hundreds of millions of people worldwide, created starvation, disease, warfare, and ecological doom, with few people learning the true cause of these disasters. The Sumerian Swindle actually has the power to destroy the world. So really, do you think the ancient people were so dumb if we modern people and even our greatest scientists still cannot understand what they accomplished? Better think again and ask yourself, how smart are our modern scientists and philosophers today if they don't understand even the simplest inventions of antiquity? How smart are our political and religious leaders if the inventions of 5000 BC are too complicated for them? You should have some respect for the intellectual achievements of ancient man, because his inventions have not only shaped our modern world, but those same inventions also threaten to destroy it. I am not referring to destroying the world with nuclear bombs or genetically modified germs. I am referring to destroying the world with the ancient mechanism of the Sumerian Swindle. And that concludes Chapter 2.